Hi, everyone. It's Hugo Bound Anderson here. Welcome to our holiday special for our Outerbounds Fireside Chats. I'm here with Ville Tuulos today, and we're going to be speaking about building ML and AI systems in next year, 2024, and beyond. We'll get started in a couple of minutes. And if you tuning in on YouTube and you'd like to introduce yourself in the chat, that'd be awesome. Let us know where you're calling in from, what your interest in ML and AI are, what you do for a living, all of these interesting things, and we'll get started in a minute. Hi, introduce yourself in the chat. All right, well, let's get started. Ville, are you there?
I think I am.
So if you could turn your camera on. Hey, happy
Hello,
holidays, my
hello.
friend.
Happy holidays. Where's your hat?
Yeah, look, my hat actually, Rudolph stole it the other day,
Oh no.
unfortunately. So, but I'm glad that you're representing the Out of Bounds team and wearing yours.
Yeah. No, I know that it's of course very warm in Australia, so maybe
It
having a hat
is,
would be
yeah,
too
it's tough
much.
at this time of year. But as I've told you and shown you, we do get Santa Claus on the beach playing cricket at this time of year as well.
That sounds wrong. Coming from Finland, I mean that sounds very
Yeah,
wrong. But
absolutely.
yeah.
Everything's turned upside down here. A couple of people have already said hi in the chat. So our friend and colleague Ramona is here, and
Awesome. Well, welcome, Ramona.
absolutely, and she's super excited to hear more about an Out of Bounds and Metaflow roadmap. She's also interested in all the graphic design stuff we have as well. So maybe we can explain a bit about the visuals. And we have David Katz here as well, who actually met you at the ramp event,
Yeah.
and
Well,
is
hello, David.
excited
Good
to see
to.
what we
Well,
have
I
to.
mean, it's kind of hard to say that good to see you. I guess we can't see that you, but good to have you here.
Um, so I want to jump in as soon as possible to
Maybe I'll take my
talk.
hat off so we can, yeah, talk more
We'll keep it.
seriously.
So I'm excited to chat with you today about the future of machine learning and AI. I just thought to let everyone know a bit about um what we do, right? So at Metaflow and Out of Bounds, we work on infrastructure and productivity tools for data scientists and MLEs that allow them to focus on building models and doing data science while having easy access to all the infrastructural layers of the stack, such as compute, orchestration, versioning. We do this through the open source Metaflow, which I'll put a link to in the YouTube chat, and also through our Out of Bounds platform. And later on in this chat, we'll talk a bit about Metaflow, the open source roadmap, how we're thinking about AI infrastructure evolving, particularly after this last year, where, what is it,
Mhm.
13 months after ChatGPT was first released. So rethinking the infrastructure story as a function of all those things. And do check out the open source project. And if it's something that interests you, please do give it a star. Um, the other thing I wanted to make clear is that this is a fireside chat series we do monthly, and in January we have a really exciting one coming up um, about we. I mean, we're going to talk about AI today, but this, of course, isn't the only thing happening in. It's easy to forget this
Yeah,
isn't the only thing happening in the
surprisingly.
space. So we're moving back
Yeah.
to thinking about data and analytics and tools and careers and how all of this is impacted by this AI revolution, and how the analytics evolution can impact the AI revolution as well. And I'm really excited to be doing that with Ben Stansel, who is a co-founder at Mode and now the field CTO after at ThoughtSpot, after Mode and ThoughtSpot joined forces. So I'm really excited for that fireside chat. So I
Yeah.
put the link to that in the YouTube chat. So definitely jump in, hit subscribe, share with friends that you think may be interested in this as well. But without further ado, I'd love to jump in and get get started, Ville. Um,
Yeah.
so you're the CEO of Outerbounds. On top of that, you used to run machine learning infrastructure at Netflix. So you've seen a lot of different sides of the story. Um, I'm interested in thinking through first how you think AI will change the nature of our experiences with products. And I think it probably, because we spend so much
Mm.
time online and a lot of this stuff does happen online, maybe we can start by thinking through how it will change the nature of online products.
Right, right. Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, first, I mean, thanks for having me. I mean, I feel honored to be here, like in this amazing series. I
Such a
realized we've
pleasure.
been
And I've
doing
been
this
trying to get
for.
you on it for years
I
now, and you've
know.
always had an
Well,
excuse.
I've been always telling you that there are so many more like interesting people, and I always enjoy hearing from other people. But no,
Mm.
I think so much has happened this year that I think that there's so much to unpack. So definitely an exciting time to talk. Yeah, no, I mean, going back to the question, you know. I think the way I see like what has been happening this year is that of course there are many new things. I mean, like goes without saying that. I mean, although I've been doing AI and ML for actually like kind of an embarrassingly long time now, a couple of decades. Of course, even like when ChatGPT came out about like you said 13 months ago, it took me by surprise how amazingly exciting and good the results were. I mean, I actually like I studied, I did my master's about natural language processing and so forth. So I've been kind of like in the field, attending conferences, and there was always the inkling that especially with more data, with more powerful models, you should be able to do more. And like it was obvious that they are like a so like the kind of such a kind of strong like statistical features in the language that like with good enough models, like we should be able to do amazing things. But still, I mean, this took us by surprise. Now, that being said, I think that the other interesting angle is that I think like what's happening right now is following the same kind of a technological kind of a adoption pattern as what has happened a number of times before when we have got our hands in a new piece of tech. And like specifically, I'm thinking like the early days of the internet, like where people rushed to create websites. I don't know, like a 98 or like a 99, and of course, like even before the dot-com boom. And like always in the initial phases of when we get to like a shiny new thing in our hands, like we just try to apply it everywhere without even much thinking about it. And I when I look back now what has happened in 2023, I think that's exactly what has been happening is that we have many companies who have been like slapping this kind of chatbot interface on top of their products. I mean, just because you can, and like it hasn't been too hard, and it's kind of exciting. And I think that that's always the first phase. I mean, the same thing happened with the websites. Companies just put up a website without much even thinking what should be on the website. Companies created the first mobile apps, like when maybe the iPhone App Store came out, just because you could, and like without much thinking, like what does it even mean, and like does it help anyone? And now the same thing with the chatbots. I think that the next thing what I'm interested in is that I think next year and going forward, companies start thinking how they can help their existing businesses using these methods and like kind of doing kind of a bit more than like just technical POCs. So that will be kind of the next phase when existing companies think that how can we improve our existing businesses using these technologies. And I'm kind of thinking that I don't know if you remember, like in the US, I mean, there was the famous, like a infamous video rental store Blockbuster that existed before Netflix, and they had a website, and Blockbuster had a website, and the idea was that, well, I mean, we can help people to find the Blockbuster branches by having the website and so forth. So that was kind of the next phase of thing. But then I think that like what's truly exciting is the third phase, and the third phase is that when we get the next generation of companies who really think from the ground up that like what are the new ways how we can totally reimagine the businesses and the products and the experiences using this new piece of tech. And that would be the comparison between having the Blockbuster website and then having Netflix, and Netflix realizing that, wait a minute, I mean, you don't even have to get the DVDs. I think that like even in the early days when they were sending the DVDs, they knew that eventually it will be streaming. And or like another fun parallel might be TikTok or like Instagram, that like it's just like a very mobile native way of doing these things. So anyway, long story short, I think that's kind of what's exciting, that like okay, we have been in kind of chapter one chapter 2 maybe next year, honestly. I mean, a couple of years forward, and then eventually, like maybe, I don't know, like a 3 to 5 years, like then we start seeing more and more of this, like a chapter 3, like really AI native services, and that's of course what's super
Absolutely.
exciting.
And if we do go back to thinking about the dot-com boom, the types of things you mentioned, like streaming and TikTok, took over a decade, if not 2 decades. I mean, 10 to 20 years after that, right? And also some pretty serious cultural shifts and like paradigm shifts in how we think about how we interact with technology. But what happened
Right.
in that time as well, like during the dot-com boom, right? We had people realize, I mean, one of the first amazing things I saw during the dot-com boom was being able to have like a text box next to a video, right? Which we have
Mhm.
today, which should be what people are watching and playing around with here, right? But that was using it for new things. I do to get slightly provocative though. I'm glad you mentioned the dot-com boom because there was a dot-com bust then, and I'm
Right.
wondering if you see some sort of Gen AI bust happening in the next several years.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think that there are multiple layers. First, I think that as always, I think there's a cohort of people who are maybe a bit overestimating the short term and maybe underestimating the long term. And like I think, I've been always wondering that is it just because like what are the expectations, how we are supposed to talk about these things at the surface level, like why, like even when I'm like following my LinkedIn feed, I see people making predictions for next year, VCs making predictions for next year, and other founders making predictions for next year. And I'm just like shaking my head that like, yeah, I mean, those things may happen, but they're not going to happen next year. I don't know like why people, I think that there's almost like a social pressure that like one can't say that, look, I mean, this is going to happen in 5 years. Nobody, I guess, like in this society has a 5-year-old, like 5-year time span or like kind of attention span. So that's why then, like when these things that we are quote unquote promised won't happen in 2024, then there's a bit of a disappointment. And that's, I mean, there's a kind of this like a psychological kind of a dot-com boom and bust that like, wait a minute, I
Yeah,
mean, it's not delivering as fast as we want. And then the other side is, of course, the financial boom and bust and like maybe some expectations that some people may have had that like, wait a minute, we invested $100 million in this startup and it didn't deliver fast enough. So yeah, that happens. But I think in this case, I mean, the fundamentals are quite strong. And I think that the undercurrents keep going, although, I mean, there's this like a surface level ups and downs as always.
absolutely. And I'm glad you mentioned LinkedIn because I mean, LinkedIn is an interesting place among other things, but it kind of I mean, LinkedIn quote unquote thought leaders aren't incentivized to necessarily post, you know, what they really think will happen in the next 5 to 10 years.
Right.
I mean, there's a big tragedy of the commons happening there as well in terms
I think
of
that,
mindshare.
I think that that's a big part of it. I think like many of the smart people who I kind of know that actually like they should know better, and I think that they know better. I think that there's some kind of social pressure that you're just not supposed to say it. So I think that that creates the kind of collective hallucination that's going on.
Absolutely. Well, speaking of hallucinations, we're building a lot of software, all of us these days, that's prone to hallucination. So I'm interested in maybe jumping in, and if you wanted to talk us through what you think a product experience could look like in the next coming years, I think that could help set the stage here.
Yeah. Well, I've been giving these presentations a couple of times this fall, and I think it has been resonating. Let's see if I can actually like pull up the slide because I think it's a fun one. Let's see here. So hopefully you can see this, but I mean this is
Yeah.
actually right. So this is a typical e-commerce store. I know it's quite small, so I don't know if you can see the details, but like it has all these couches or sofas, and this used to be like what e-commerce was 2014. And now like if you fast forward like to this year, like then we get these bigger images, like it's a bit more like human centric, a bit more enticing. And then the interesting question here is that like, okay, so given that this is kind of like a state of the art today, which is in some sense looks pretty ordinary today, like where could we be going with all this? And then I've been sharing this picture in the presentation, like where the idea is that I think like we are like approaching the point with the maturity of the tech that we could really take these experiences to the next level, so that instead of like doing the usual like a point and click with the mouse and like choosing like the form fields and the drop downs, we can actually like start making the whole experience way more visceral. That like if you look at that picture, it's almost like as if you were in this like a furniture showroom. And then like you can have that like a text box up there asking that, okay, I mean, like, what do you want to buy? And then you say that, okay, I mean, maybe I want a pink sofa. And like suddenly like it shows you a pink sofa, or like maybe you want to get the leather sofa and it shows you a leather sofa. So I think that this is what I would characterize kind of like really like doing the kind of the level 3 thinking, that like what is a whole new way of thinking about the experiences, like moving beyond the kind of the usual like a point and click, that the websites that all of us have been now staring for, I don't know, like 20 years. And I think that that's the exciting thing. But I mean, now I don't want to make the same mistake as the kind of people I just criticized by saying that this is going to happen in 2024. I don't think so. I think that this is going to happen over the next 10 years, because also like, I mean, of course, there are like still many even technical questions that need to be solved before we quite get here.
Well,
But
yeah,
I think that's super exciting.
and what I was thinking was, I mean, you made it look really easy, which is what technology does in the end, right? But let's just think through what happened there. Previously, you had some, front end JavaScript, whatever it is. Somebody clicks on a sofa or something, and it probably executes some sweet SQL query in a database, which then will serve you some results, and you click through something like that. But fast forward to 2026, and now we actually, I mean, you made it look easy, but we have a whole variety of generative AI, whether it be text to, like, let's say I want a leather sofa, then it's text to image stuff happening there. There's maybe a large language model you're interacting with in the chat, all of these types of things, right?
Right, exactly. And I think really the key thing, and I think that this is really the kind of a key to all kind of the technological advancements. I think that there's this saying that the civilization advances by increasing the number of things we can do without thinking about them. And like if you look at the picture, there's almost like a nothing technical that you see in the picture. But there's so much depth under the hood. I mean, so many moving parts that it is mind-boggling. So I think that's really the interesting thing. What's happening is that we are kind of pushing all that complexity kind of below, so that like we only surface this like a very beautiful, like a very human-centric picture in the very front. But yes, I think that there are many still like questions that are unsolved, like kind of that. Okay, I mean, like how do you make that LLM thing right there, so that when you ask something, kind of it actually doesn't hallucinate. You don't want to have a generic chatbot. It should be the most knowledgeable salesperson about furniture. And then like how do you actually like not only showcase some couches, but exactly the couches that you have in your inventory. And like let's say that maybe that like a living room that you see, maybe you can submit your own photo and you can match it in your own environment. So there are still like even open computer vision questions there. So I absolutely don't want to kind of make it sound like as if it was easy or even possible today. But I think the kind of the price at the end of the rainbow is actually like a quite enticing. So I'm pretty sure that like there will be many people who will try to get there.
Great. And as we've kind of hinted at, this isn't just machine learning, data science, AI in the abstract. Here it's interacting with web services and front-end engineering and browsers and that type of stuff. So I think thinking even more broadly, do you see this type of product experience interacting with augmented reality or virtual reality or voice to text type of things? I suppose the real question is, are we going to have some sort of Jarvis at some point from Iron Man? The glasses that you speak to with these types of products.
Yeah. Like if you look at if you watch, I don't know, like do you remember like ever like seeing the show Jetsons, the kind of the cartoon? I think it's like a
the
1950s
Jetsons.
thing. Yeah, exactly. Like all that like old like a sci-fi where they kind of reimagined, kind of extrapolated what the world will look like in who knows like a 2000 or something, or like maybe 100 years from now. And then it's always fascinating that they get some things right and some things terribly wrong. And I think like kind of today, like we are probably doing the same thing, that like some of these projections, like in the picture that I was showing, I think like some of those things most likely will happen. And then like maybe we expect that maybe all of us will have some like a VR headset or something. And maybe some of those things actually won't happen. It just turns out that it's not the very kind of human way of doing these things. So of course, like I don't know exactly. I have a much like a stronger confidence in certain things happening than like a certain other things. And I think it's pretty like kind of it's just like using these existing kind of interface paradigms probably is here to stay. But I mean, then like what are the services we interact with? I think that will quite radically change.
Absolutely. And to be clear, I always thought the Jetsons was kind of just like the Flintstones, but with flying cars. Like
Yeah.
it was like our prehistoric. And there was a Christmas special. Everyone should go back and watch this. Like the Jetsons have a time machine and they meet the Flintstones at some point. There's like
I
a
think it's the same studio. Yeah, probably the
yeah,
same animators. So
yeah.
yeah,
Was it Hanna-Barbera or something like that?
I
I
think
don't know.
so. Yeah.
Look, we've got some great questions in the chat. David he says he loves this example. He's interested in how you would apply it to an article or news focused website. I'd love your thoughts on that. Ramona has already written before David asked that question about the possibility of AI generated articles, and I suppose my cynical, banal Black Mirror hot take, for lack of a better term, is, I don't know if you saw this, Ville, last week. Was the first like at scale AI generated news anchors presenting AI generated stories. And so,
Mm.
the real,
Yeah.
I suppose dystopia is everything's AI generated. Of course, that won't necessarily happen. But I do think if we applied this to a news focused website, you would get a lot of things that are AI generated as well.
Yeah. 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 No, I mean, well, I mean, what my comment there is that I think, well, okay, so if you allow me to take a step back, so there has been all this talk about the kind of the AI doomsdayers and like how the kind of the humankind will be destroyed. And I have a hard time believing that anything of that graphical will happen. I think like people think about the Terminators and the RoboCops and
Mm.
stuff like that, and whatever like kind of a runaway HDI or singularity. I really don't think that like any of that will happen. We can get deeper into that. However, I think like what will happen and like will be potentially quite problematic are that these like more subtle societal norms and expectations will get undermined. And like always, the favorite example is that like for the past, I don't know, like 1,000 years, we have been able to measure a person's kind of like some kind of aptitude or cognitive abilities by their capability of producing many pages of coherent text. I mean, that's what PhD theses are about, and that's what you do at school. You write term papers, and like even at the workplace, you write memos and so forth. And the kind of the better you have been able to kind of produce this written communication, it kind of indicates that okay, I mean, there's maybe something going on between your ears. Now, I think that is obviously going to quite change with LLMs, and the fact that actually like you can produce infinite amount of basically like a perfectly high quality text, at least syntactically, maybe the semantics a bit aside. And like it's very hard for anyone to judge your cognitive capabilities based on that, which means that like yes, I mean inevitably certain things need to change. It's just like how we evaluate things in education and so forth. And now going back to the kind of the news anchor example, I think that this has been of course a long time coming, but I mean maybe for the past 100 years there has been a bit of an expectation that if you see a moving image of someone, that means that the person is real. I guess I have like a slight expectation that Hugo, you are real, kind of. But I mean, I think that will get eroded. And I don't think that is necessarily the end of the world. I think it will be a bit painful because we have to establish new ways of like building the kind of the trust relationships and like understanding like what is fake news and whatnot. But I think that's probably going to be one of the kind of the more painful things that will happen. But on the other hand, like look, I mean, what has been happening with social media over the past 10 years. I mean, it hasn't been exactly kind of quite clean. I mean, it has been quite messy, and somehow like we have been like a kind of like a kind of a getting through all that.
Incredibly messy. And I love the examples you gave, because something that comes to mind is the first time people were shown a screening of a film in the early 1900s of a train coming towards the camera, everyone
Right.
screamed and jumped out of the way, right?
Right.
And we're kind of having that going through those types of things. And when you're like, oh no, wait, this is what that is, doesn't necessarily
Right.
change how your fight or flight mechanism responds the first few times, but then you become accustomed to it, I think.
Yeah.
And I do think the establishment of new norms and new types of behavior will be important. So Herb Simon, a technologist and sociologist in the 1970s, he saw what was happening with respect to information, and he actually said in the 70s, I think, as information up until now has been a scarce resource, as it becomes an abundant resource, attention will become the rate limiting scarce resource.
Mm-hmm.
To say that
Yeah.
in the 70s, I'm just like, wow, super
Yeah.
prescient. But I think
Yeah.
with the amount, to your point, with the amount of content LLMs and Gen AI more generally, not just text-based, can create, we're going to have to think about how we, give our attention in a variety of different ways and establish new personal and societal
Yeah.
norms there.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm well, I mean, first, I'm kind of quite optimistic, and I think that we tend to underestimate like how adaptable people are. And there's a bit of a generational shift, and that actually also like plays into the question that like why these things tend to take a bit longer than expected. Because usually like especially like a next generation of people, they just like as you are born in a certain kind of environment, you kind of learn the norms in a very different way. Like another example that I like to use is that I've been using kind of like a chat communication, like IRC and stuff, like for a very long time, like basically like pretty much all my life. But I mean, when I first entered the workforce, like using something like kind of a chat communication in a professional environment, it was super strange and nobody would do it. I mean, there was the kind of like the previous generation of people who just hadn't used that form of
Mm.
communication, that you type real-time messages to other people. It just didn't exist. And then you fast forward like a 10, 15, 20 years, and now everybody is using something like Slack or Microsoft Teams, and it's totally natural. And I think that it's much because like a big part of the workforce today have been using systems like this all their life. So it's not a big deal. It's not an issue. I mean, it's totally normal. And like to your point about, let's say, the kind of the news and so forth, I think like we will be getting the next generation of people like who even question that, okay, I mean, does it matter? Does it matter? I mean, like, why would it matter if the news anchor is a human or non-human? I mean, what's the big deal? I mean, it doesn't make any difference. Already
Mm.
now we know that there are news anchors who speak nonsense. I mean, like the fact that like somebody's actually like a meat and flesh. I mean, it doesn't make them any like a fundamentally more trustworthy per se, right? Or do you care if the weather person is a kind of a digitally created avatar or an actual human being? I don't know. I mean, we are just used to the fact that they are people. So
Yeah, and to your, I mean, I wouldn't cast shade on anyone, but I like news anchors of all people. There is occasionally something a bit uncanny valley about the.
yeah, and I know that there's a big societal norm, and I know like in this country and in many other countries, it used to be so that like news anchors, like by nature, they were supposed to be trustworthy,
Yep.
and their name and their presence like somehow had that ethos that like you can trust what they say. But I mean, we know that like even that has been changing and kind of, and then I think it's a. I don't want to make it sound like too cynical because I don't think it is, but I think there's a bit of a trend line just continuing. So, and then we
Yeah,
will just find new ways of establishing the trust.
absolutely. So I want to jump into a few technical things. First, I just want to clarify for those who haven't heard how we think about machine learning infrastructure before. One thing I do want to say is that we try to think quite holistically about the whole machine learning and AI infrastructure stack, as opposed to providing a point solution for compute and another one for versioning and another one for experimentation tracking, another one for orchestration. We really view machine learning infrastructure as a cohesive whole where you have something like data at the bottom, then compute, versioning, orchestration, deployment modeling with your favorite packages. And we want data scientists and MLEs to have as good a developer experience with this entire stack
Right.
of infrastructure. Now, without giving away too many details, I do think that a lot of the details will change, but the stack itself doesn't change so much with the advent of generative AI. But some things
Right.
are weighted more heavily. So, as we've seen, Gen AI requires a significant amount of compute, and even recently, when OpenAI, I think, reopened like ChatGPT Plus or whatever it was, right? Like Sam Altman tweeted out, "Hey, we've got access to more GPUs, so we're able to open this again." And I'm just
Right.
citing that as what I could have cited one of a trillion examples, but that's one that's in the cult. Like even the CEO of OpenAI is pretty transparent about their lack of access to GPUs. All of this is
Right.
Prelude. I'm really interested in what you think about the present of solving for the compute layer of the ML and AI stack, and how you see things playing out in the next several years.
Yeah, totally, totally. I think that's, like when it comes to the kind of this like underlying engines like for the AI revolution or whatever you want to call it. I mean, compute is absolutely like one of the key things. I think that there are like multiple things that are going on simultaneously, which kind of makes it kind of somewhat confusing. And I can maybe list them one by one. So I think that the first thing that like absolutely shouldn't be underestimated always is that I don't know. I mean, this chart is pretty small here, but I mean you can hopefully see the downward slope. And actually, like here's like on the y-axis you have a logarithmic scale, and on the x-axis you have time. I think it goes all the way back to the 60s or so. And you can see that there's this like, and the kind of a question here is that like, what is the cost of like 1 gigaflops of compute? So basically like kind of what's the cost of compute? And what you can see in this chart, I mean, you can see that like linear path, it's a logarithmic scale. So there's basically an exponential drop in the cost of compute. And this has been going on kind of basically forever. And I think that like the reason why I wanted to show this is that I don't think that this development is stopping anywhere. I think that like we absolutely see exponential increase in the amount of compute power that is available. So in that sense, like somehow like all the doomsday talk that like like somehow like we are running out of compute. I mean, yes, maybe in the short term. I mean, this year has been painful, but in the long term, I mean, it's just amazing, like kind of like how much more like power there will be available. So I think that absolutely shouldn't be underestimated. And like let's say specifically on the inference side, I mean, like even over the past month, like we have seen massive advances in the kind of optimizing the inference path and the cost of running the inference. So I mean, I totally expect that in a couple of years' time, like we will be at the point where like doing the LLM inference gets so cheap that it's not even worth talking about anymore. In the same way as, let's say, we don't talk about the internet bandwidth as we used to talk in the early days of the internet. That was a big deal that, oh, like, am I able to download videos online? And that was like amazing. Yes, no, I can. But I mean, these days, who cares? I mean, just works, right? So that's the first thing. I think like, yeah, if you just like allow me to show this other one, because this is also like one of the fun slides. Again, I mean, quite small. But like the path that you see happening here is kind of like the amount of compute that we want to execute. So you know that there's kind of this supply and demand. So the previous chart was about the supply, that we kind of get the exponential supply, but that's also like driven by pretty much like exponential demand. And I think that that's also like what's really happening is that I think we have been like for the past couple of decades, we have been in this strange situation that we have had like some pretty basic workloads for compute, pretty basic needs for compute, and like much like driven by SQL, if you can see that. But now like finally, and like what's really changing is that we have this whole new workload, which is the ML and AI, which is like much driving this demand for much more compute. So I think in that sense, like we are almost like hitting this like equilibrium state, like where like we have much more demand, but also like we will have much more supply. And this far, like we have been kind of a bit kind of like limited on the demand side because we just didn't know like what to do with all that compute. And now finally we know like what to do with compute. So I think it will be fun, but also like it will definitely change the landscape. And maybe that's the last thing that I want to say about this topic, like here. And I don't know if you can really see the kind of the last one, but this is super important for us. And maybe we can talk about this more like for us at Outerbounds, is that the compute providers are becoming more heterogeneous. So it used to be so that you could just, like in the early days, you just had like maybe your own mainframe and like maybe you then had your AWS account. But now already this year, like we are absolutely getting to the point where more and more of our customers are like a shopping between different clouds and like even specialized clouds like CoreWeave and even like on-prem boxes inside their desks and so forth. So although like we will have that exponential supply of compute, it won't be necessarily in a single place, but it will be so that like you kind of want to have a bit of a portfolio in the same way, like if you even like draw the parallel to energy, that it's not that like we have all like nuclear or all solar or all hydropower, but it's kind of like a portfolio of different like energy providers or different compute providers. So that will be fun and definitely a bit of a like a technical challenge in the short term as well.
Well, as you know, they say during a gold rush, sell picks. Firstly, is that even a good analogy in any way? So I want to challenge that saying, but if we do accept that, are GPUs the picks of today's gold rush?
Yeah, I think it's quite, I mean, quite short term. Especially like the problem with that is that it's actually like a quite capital intensive in contrast to pickaxes. And actually, like being here, I mean, like it's a bit of a tangent, but interestingly enough, like here in San Francisco, there's a bit of a gold rush here, like kind of a, I don't know, like 250 years ago or so. And actually, they sold eggs like during the gold rush. And actually, like I would hypothesize that actually like selling eggs during the gold rush is better business than selling pickaxes. So because you can like
Amazing.
just provision the eggs quicker, you don't have to spend so much money in getting the eggs than even pickaxes, not to mention anything more expensive.
So what are the eggs of today?
Yeah, well, I think that's the thing that there's the eggs of today, then there are the eggs of tomorrow, and then there are the eggs like for the next 10 years. And
Yeah.
I think that like we have a bit more like long-term point of view. And I think like really the interesting thing for us is to work with all the builders, all the people like kind of David and Ramona and like others in this show as well, like thinking that like, okay, how do we build this next generation of services and like what are the building blocks there? And then of course these ingredients like the X and GPUs and pickaxes, they will change over years and the landscape will change. But they're like especially the fundamentals of how do you build these services, how do you build these systems, and ultimately it is people building these systems and imagining the experiences, and that's kind of the part that like really requires much more thinking.
Yeah. And also, I do want to challenge the assumption that all workflows are GPU in intensive and will be
Right.
increasingly so. Of course, the people selling GPUs and the people selling um, LLMs for in a variety of ways, and closed LLMs want to create like they want to dreamweave the scarcity of GPUs for various reasons themselves. But at the moment, I suppose there's an argument as we get more and more compute, we're just going to get bigger and bigger models, which people want to bigger and bigger and better and better. Now, the
Mm.
question, of course, is what model lift do you actually get there? How better is this model for your purposes? And
Right.
as a lot of us are talking about now, there is, and I want your opinions on this, but there is a bright future where a lot of people, for the example you gave of
Mhm.
e-commerce, sofa shopping, perhaps you won't need ChatGPT. You'll have a far smaller model that you've fine-tuned or
Right.
use something like RAG on. And it isn't actually that GPU, the inference isn't that GPU intensive at the end.
Right. Right. Exactly. And I think that this is the other picture that I oftentimes show, like kind of there, like the sofa thing in the middle. But again, I know the boxes are probably too small to read. But the idea here is that like we have so many different parts to actually building a service like this. There's the LLM and there's the computer vision part, and then like maybe you generate the descriptions live and so forth. But besides that, like you have all the other parts of the business, like kind of how do you even like get the sofas, the logistics part, like how do you keep the business running? How do you estimate the lifetime value? And as it always happens, it turns out that you know that there's the old like the hidden technical depth of ML paper, like where the models are like just small in the middle. And then like there's always the realization that, oh my gosh, I mean, yeah, there are so many things around the models that is relevant. And I think that the same thing will happen here. That yes, as of today, like we are much obsessed that okay, I mean, like what is the latest and greatest model? But I mean, at the end of the day, it's all about the data. It's all about like what are the systems around the thing, how often you are able to update this, how well it resonates with your specific audience. There are like so many moving parts around the models that at the end of the day the model is important, but it's really not everything. And
Mm.
that's again, I mean, like well, like to your point what you mentioned before about like thinking about the whole stack a bit more holistically. I think that's super important.
Well, and to your point now, this dovetails really nicely in what I wanted your thoughts on next. I mean, we've been there've been so many advances in AI in the past year. It's mind-boggling. Every week there's been more and more. Um, but does that mean everything is forever and forever will be AI now, or what remains? And I think as a maybe a slightly provocative question, when deep learning became um, far more easy to access with APIs such as Keras, for example, a lot of people were able to do deep learning. A lot of my friends who were then able to do deep learning and colleagues would still use logistic regression or naive
Right.
Bayes or something like that, right? So what remains of our previous world now with all of this cool gadgetry?
Yeah. And I think like my like maybe a slightly provocative take on and the answer to that is that kind of everything remains. I think that that's actually like kind of how our society has become more complex, is that we don't exactly replace previous things with new things. I mean, we just add. We keep adding and adding and adding. And like even today, like you use your like on your iPhone, you use some like a airline company like a mobile app that's the latest, fanciest kind of a tech built with Flutter, like the mobile app. And then it actually talks to a backend that was written in 1970s, where actually the ticket reservation happens. And it's not so that this new tech somehow replaced the 1970s tech, but I mean it's on top. And I think that the same thing will happen absolutely here with AI as well. That 98% of everything that exists today kind of continues existing, but then we just gain so many new capabilities. We can do so much more, and that's really the exciting part. Now, the 2% there, and like I don't know, maybe 5% is that yes, I think like especially with the NLP and computer vision, I mean it is a fact that like especially in those domains, like there are like a certain things that you simply don't have to do anymore because you can do so much better with the LLMs. But I mean, like kind of thinking about like many other things like ETL pipelines and data and so forth, there will maybe changes here and there. But I mean, like by and large, I mean, those concerns will stay for the longest period of time anyways.
You know what my real question is? Will we still have to use regular expressions?
Good question. Well, I think that's well, okay, so that kind of goes back to the question of like what kind of people will be building these systems.
Mm,
It's kind of like remember for the longest time we have had this development that the abstraction level of programming languages has been going up, and today of course we have huge number of people programming in Python, right?
mm.
And like for the longest time, like certain communities have been thinking and talking that like how many people have to know C, or like how many people have to know like assembly language and stuff like that. And I would actually argue that like probably as of today, we have more people who know assembly language than we had 1970s. And it's not so that like we actually need so much more assembly. It's just that like we have more people in the industry.
Mm.
And I think like to your question, like do we have, and I know that it was of course like a tongue-in-cheek question, like I'm just using the opportunity kind of to give a silly answer. But the point is that I think in some ways we may have more people using it, but relatively less. Because also like what I think what will happen with AI is that it's just amazing that like it really does democratize the whole like setup, so that we will have more people like building all kinds of systems. And like first and foremost, maybe they do first prompt engineering, and then they realize that, oh my gosh, like I need to remove the new lines, and then they have to write the one regex. And so again, I mean the answer is both. So I don't think LLMs will be replacing regexes.
Absolutely. And I mean, it was a tongue-in-cheek question, but it also wasn't. I mean, they're seriously important and frustrating things. For those who are interested in jumping in, I've just put a link into a website called regexcrossword.com, where you get to give yourself a Christmas present, holiday season present, by doing regular expressions crosswords.
Yeah.
Truly brutal stuff. I do want to jump in, and we've had Cheyenne has just commented, Metaflow is really great. Thank you so much. I do want to jump into talking about Metaflow and Outer Bounds in the world of AI, but before that, I mean, you mentioned skills and roles. I'm interested in how you see personas and their skill sets changing. For example, do you see the AI engineer displacing the ML engineer, or do you see? I mean, there are lots of conversations around AI at the moment, but there's surprisingly few conversations currently about what AI is going to do to labor forces and labor markets as
Right.
well. So with coding assistance, do you see, for example, the demand side for ML engineers being significantly less and maybe data engineers being more? Or what are your prognostications on what will
Right.
happen with all of these
Right.
roles?
Well, I mean, maybe taking a step back and like because I know the titles are really hard, and like for the past 10 years, like we have had really kind of hard time in the industry, like figuring that like who's exactly a data scientist and who's an ML engineer and who's an AI engineer and like who's something else. So I think like kind of maybe showing this picture here. So I
Oh
think
yeah.
that this is kind of the holy trinity, like kind of how I think about things is that like there are kind of three different modalities that really matter. So like on the kind of here, like you have data. So and I think first, I mean, I think that this is a big thing that I mean has been coming for decades and decades. So But I think that the data becomes increasingly integral part of all systems that we build. And then like here on this other side, I don't know if it's left or right for you, we have a code. And now, like interestingly enough, like we have had like a big distinction historically, like between people who deal with data and people who deal with code. And like especially like we have had like a whole cadres of software engineers who only ever deal with code. And their whole thing as a software engineer is to kind of write code. And then we have had like a bit of a smaller group of people, data engineers and data scientists who deal with data. And like as we know, I mean, there hasn't been always like a perfect interaction between the two. And then of course, like on top of the stack, we have models, like people who build mathematical models. And that has been a very almost like exclusive group of people for the longest time, historically, like people with the background in statistics and so forth. And I think that the interesting thing that's really happening now more strongly with LLMs, but I think it has been a long time coming, is that like we understand that like increasingly all systems need all the three components and they are intimately interconnected. So you always need the data component and like you need code to kind of like organize the kind of the data and so forth. The data doesn't flow by itself. You need to write some code. But also now, like we have, of course, the modeling part, and like the models come in many different shapes and sizes. LLMs being, of course, like one type of models. So anyway, so this is to say that I think whatever like we will be building in the future, I mean, this is the kind of again like one of the hot takes here. I think we'll have these three elements, and like we have been in the situation before that like we have had people who have only focused on like one side of the one corner of the triangle. But I think increasingly we will have people who kind of deal with, I mean, maybe with different biases with all the sides. And to your point about the co-pilot, let's say I think we will have many people in the future who kind of still focus much more on the kind of that like a data model side of things. And then they can leverage co-pilots to kind of write the code, just the amount of code that they have to write. And there's a bit of more like a leaning to that side. And then on the other hand, like we have a people who are a bit more leaning to the coding side. And then again, I mean, they can just use like really easy Python libraries to deal with the models and get the off-the-shelf LLMs from Hugging Face, and then like put some data there. So I think like we are all like interestingly kind of like working inside this triangle. And yes, I mean, I don't know like where do you draw the lines between different titles and like who do you call what? But I think it's all like just getting kind of mushed into this like inside the triangles.
Yeah, I love that. And I do think, though, historically, what we've seen with data scientists, MLE, data analysts, all of these types of things, the reason titles have been able to settle and have some form of stability is because the way we approach the technology slows down, at least in how we incorporate it into enterprise business platforms and software. I suppose a provocative version of the question is, do you see the Gen AI space slowing down? Because we haven't seen it slow down in the past year. Do you see it continuing to accelerate like it has?
Yes, yes. No, I think it like yes, it well, I mean the accelerate. I mean the problem. I, mean, I think it's a bit of like a question of like general relativity. Like kind of I think that it depends on your like kind of as an
Frame
observer
of reference, yeah.
that like, in the frame of reference that you stand somewhere and then like does it accelerate or like does it decelerate or like which way it goes. If the question is that like are we putting more and more resources in utilizing these things? Absolutely. I think kind of we are only in the very, very beginning, and I think that there will be infinitely more resources that will be poured in like making all these things happen and like optimizing the models and so forth. Now, at the same time, it kind of becomes business as usual, which I think like might produce the illusion that now, I mean, nothing is happening. It's kind of like if you think about any tech, I don't know, like hard disks and like a storage. Most of us like, oh, like I mean, you store your like a photos on like USB stick or like on the hard drive, and you think that okay, nothing happens. It's just tech that works. But I mean, probably there are like I don't know, like 100,000 people in the world whose only job is to think about storage and improving storage and making it more reliable and so forth. And of course, that is super mature tech, and like of course, the AI is still like in the very early phases of that. So yes, I think more resources will be put into that. Yes, it will be accelerating, but it actually, to many of us, it may seem that actually like it just becomes more mainstream and like less exciting.
But this is
Hopefully, I mean,
incredibly important for
yeah,
people who want to work in AI, but also put roofs over their family's head and feed their family and this type of stuff, right? Because
right.
it seems like maybe there'll be a lot of jobs in AI in the coming several years, and people may think that in a decade that will still be the case. Whereas to your point that maybe 100 people in the world think about storage robustly now, this is something where it could happen with AI, right?
Yeah, yeah. But also, like, I think it's a question that, like, I mean, it's the same thing as like you could have asked me 98 that like how many people will have jobs in the internet, and like as of today, I guess like it's hard to find almost any jobs that wouldn't be affected by the internet
Absolutely.
somehow,
Yep.
right? And but I mean, at the same time, there are like very few people who are maybe working on like a switches and hubs and the kind of internet infrastructure. Like maybe few people who are developing web servers, some good number of people developing websites still, and stuff like that. So I think it will be all over the place. I think like that's my point, that I think most developers, like whoever like touches software or builds services, will be affected by AI. So in that sense, you will be working in AI by some definition of the words.
Absolutely. But to your point, if in the early 2000s someone had said, I want to build websites, I would have said, well, that could be lucrative for some time. But then,
Yeah.
Squarespace started selling eggs, right? Or WordPress
Yeah.
started
Yeah.
selling eggs, right?
Yeah.
Um,
But
cool.
I think at the same time, it just makes it more exciting for more people, because
Yeah.
ultimately it is about like making these experiences more human centric, less about the machines and more about humans. And I think that that's absolutely the case. If you today like you go and pitch to a VC that I want to set up an e-commerce store, like nobody wants to hear that, oh, I know how to set up a web server and I know how to set up a load balancer. It's all about that, like what is your angle about the market? What do you understand the product? What do you understand about the audience? And I think in many ways it also like it just opens it up for more people who just like understand their niche domains better, like, and the kind of the low level infrastructure kind of fades in the background
Yeah,
in many ways.
absolutely. So I want to jump into Metaflow now.
Yeah.
Once again, I just want to give everyone a bit of context, and Ville, you can correct or add or subtract anything from my statements. But Metaflow is an open source framework in Python that allows data scientists and machine learning engineers and AI engineers to access the whole stack of infrastructure for machine learning and AI while focusing on the stuff they love to do, such as work with data and build models and deploy and that type of stuff. Metaflow, Ville and company built at Netflix, released it first in 2017, open sourced it in 2019, got a lot of adoption across many verticals, a lot of companies. They started, I joined Outerbounds what 2 years ago now, just over two,
Something
two
like
and a
that.
half.
Yeah.
Um, in order to help people work with Metaflow, but more generally help people build AI and ML systems.
Right.
So feel free to add any context to that. But my question for you is, with everything we've seen in the past year, is Metaflow even going to be relevant in the world of AI?
Yeah. No, I think it's a good question. And of course, the question that like all of us should be asking, well, I mean, not all of us, but I mean, like, I guess me specifically, and like whoever like is working here, like should be asking. And of course, there's a bit of a confirmation bias here, but I think going back, let's see if I can like show, I mean, just to repeat what you just said there, that I mean, this is the picture that has been on the Metaflow website since the very early days. And like even like way back when at Netflix, we realized that one reason why building these ML AI driven systems has been so tedious in the past is that there are many parts to this stack. And like you have to think about data, you have to think about compute, you have to think about orchestration, you have to think about the versioning. And like first, even understanding like of all the layers of the stack, I mean, it's not something we can take for granted. And then secondly, like kind of understanding how you implement all these pieces is not trivial always. And like we started with Metaflow thinking that, okay, I mean, how can we provide, I mean, an easy interface for people to kind of navigate the stack? We didn't want to reinvent it, like all the wheels. There are many good solutions for data, many good solutions for compute, but at least like putting all these pieces together. And now I would claim that like if you just like look at this stack here, like what are the parts that are still important? I mean, I don't think it like anybody denies that like a data wouldn't be important. If anything, there has been a lot of talk about how the LLMs by themselves like are only as good as the data you are able to create. I think like even OpenAI made some comments of this nature, that it's really like about their like capability of like creating and like finding the data set, and of course the whole like a human in the loop evaluation that's important. So data is here to stay. The compute, well, I mean, we just talk about compute, so enough said. I guess it's given that like compute is only getting more important. Orchestration refers to the fact that the models, again, as we just discussed, I mean, they don't exist in isolation. They don't live on an island, but they're always part of a larger system. So you have to orchestrate everything around it. And then versioning relies on the kind of or refers to the fact that like it's people building these systems. So we have to do multiple iterations. We have to be able to track all the work. I don't think that that's going anywhere. So I guess in some blog post we had this picture that showed that whereas like we have been talking about the fact that like usually there are people who think more on kind of the infrastructure side, the yellow side, kind of the low level things, and then like the data scientists historically who have been more on the high level of the stack. So this year it seems that this discussion has been skewed so that like much focus has been either on the kind of the low level, on the kind of what kind of data is available, what kind of compute is needed to kind of train like a Llama 2 or something, or then like it has been only like at the very top that, okay, I mean, like which model is the best. But we have kind of like the kind of the middle layers of the stack have been a bit underrepresented. But I don't think it's an indication that they wouldn't be needed. It's just that we have got this like a shiny new piece of tech, which is the models, and like not so many people have been building actual systems with the models. So that has been kind of a bit in the background. But now, as we enter these next chapters that I mentioned before, that like companies are getting a bit more serious and like moving beyond the POCs. I think again, I mean, there's the realization that wait a minute, we have to be able to orchestrate these things. We have to be able to keep track of all the work. So we are kind of like in some sense back to like where we started from, which is not the bad thing. I mean, I honestly think that this is the way how you build systems when you are dealing with code, data, and models.
Absolutely. And this year has seen, I've been really excited about the amount of things we've released on the Metaflow side, from integration with Airflow to multi-cloud support to event triggering, which allows you to make flows of flows or have machine learning workflows, essentially build reactive systems. So having event buses within all of your machine learning pipelines. So if my S3 bucket is updated, then that can trigger my training flow again, which then can trigger an inference flow. So there've been a lot of wonderful things this year. I'm interested in hear what you're excited about in the future of Metaflow on the roadmap in 2024 in particular.
Yeah. Well, I mean, many things. I have to say that there's actually like something. I mean, this is like a very practical stuff. And by the way, I mean, one thing that I absolutely like should mention is that in times like this, like we really get attracted by big splashy announcements like the Mistrals or the Google Geminis and so forth. But as always in practice, it's actually the small details that matter. It's not the kind of the splashy like new big things, but it's kind of all the paper cuts. And like I'm sure that like many of us who have been building these systems in practice, who are maybe listening to this show as well, know that it's kind of like just the basic questions that like how easily you can like pip install a package, and like how easily you can deploy it to production, and how easily you can monitor these things in production. And those details is ultimately like what really matter, like not the kind of the splashy stuff. So, and on that note, like for instance, like hopefully, I don't want to kind of set the expectations too high, but like for instance, like in January, hopefully, like we will be releasing this like a dynamic card feature in Metaflow in open source, where in real time you can actually like monitor your tasks as they are executing when you're, let's say, fine tuning a Llama model or like running a DBT pipeline or like whatever custom thing you are doing. You are able to monitor that in real time. It kind of like sounds pretty mundane in the midst of all this high-flying AI talk, but I mean, it's honestly something that like we have seen over years and years, like really makes a big difference. So that's definitely a big one. We have always talked about making it easier to kind of start composing these increasingly complex systems. So that's hopefully something that we can get to, and then like many smaller things about just the kind of the basic questions like the dependency management, also like making compute even easier. There, of course, the kind of the diversity of compute is just exploding or will be exploding next year. And we will be supporting more and more different compute platforms. So like different people can access compute wherever they see fit and stuff like that. So yeah, no, I definitely feels that like in some sense we are just getting started.
Absolutely. And for anyone interested in keeping up to date with what we're talking about and what we're releasing, I'm just going to put a link to our community Slack in YouTube, where we're having conversations like this there all the time. So if you're interested, do come and say hi. We had a great question from Cheyenne about what main products Outerbounds offers besides Metaflow. I put a link to Outerbounds platform, of course, but this dovetails really nicely in what I wanted to chat with you about next. What's on the Outerbounds roadmap? And maybe you can give us a brief rundown for those who don't know of what Outerbounds is first. We've talked about Metaflow, so what's Outerbounds?
Yeah, that's a great question, of course. And I could just like show you this like architecture diagram here. And so what we do, exactly to the point that I made earlier about having many layers of infrastructure stack as you want to start building these systems. Now, Metaflow was born at Netflix, and Netflix has actually hundreds of people operating these different infrastructure layers, like compute platforms, like data platforms. They have built many different orchestration systems. And hence, a system like Metaflow is able to really quite literally like stand on the shoulders of giants, so that like when, let's say, you want to build a service using AI and ML, you are able to use Metaflow to do so, and it will then run on this super industrial strength platform, like maintained by hundreds of engineers. Now, knowing that like most companies out there don't have 500 engineers, like just keeping the platform up and running, but having seen how beneficial it is, with Outerbounds, like we always had the vision that like wouldn't it be amazing like if even smaller companies and even individual developers had access to a platform like that. So that like what you see in this picture is that like basically what we do is that, let's say you have your own cloud account, you have your AWS, Azure, or GCP account, we can deploy this platform on your side. So then you can take Metaflow, which makes it very easy to build these systems, and then deploy it on your account on this infrastructure that is actually managed by Outerbounds in the same way as Netflix's team manages Netflix's infrastructure. And then like you can actually really focus on this like innovating at the higher layers of the stack. Like how do you reimagine those product experiences? And like how do you actually like really help your business produce business value, and like instead of focusing on these lower layers. And what's really important here is that like it's still runs on your account. What's really important here is that we are like making it easy for you to access compute wherever it is. I mean, this is a big part of the story, that like we are not one of the vendors like trying to resell compute and saying that, okay, we provide the cheapest GPUs while adding margin on top of somebody else's GPUs, but we actually help you get to the source and like get like all that like a raw material for the products that you want to build like in the most cost efficient manner. So I mean, I think that like, especially like this year has shown that like this type of stack, I mean, this type of platform is kind of exactly the foundation that you need as you start reimagining those services. Now, one thing that I do want to mention is that like, if you want to just like build the fastest like a chatbot, I mean, honestly, I mean, this is not the platform for that. I mean, you can just call an OpenAI API and like have something small. And that's really not quite our focus. So our focus is that like once you want to take a step further, and we have made it as easy as possible for you to start like really like owning your own models, like building your own systems, and like kind of moving to the next level.
Yeah, and to that point, actually, as you know, I gave a talk with our wonderful colleague and customer Thierry at Atomy. It's a wonderful online learning platform where he recently spoke about in this talk we gave about how using Metaflow and Outerbounds, he was actually very easily able to switch out ChatGPT as an API for a fine-tuned Llama model that fine-tune themselves, right? With virtually no migration cost. So these are the types of things we're really interested in helping people achieve.
Yeah, no, and super exciting. And I think what they are building, I mean, it's a great example of exactly this next generation of services, like really like rethinking how we can provide these product experiences, in this case, in education. And like, then also like building your own differentiated models instead of hitting the same APIs as everybody else.
Yep. So there are so many tools and vendors in the space at the moment. I am interested in where you position Outerbounds in the broader landscape of ML and AI tooling. So can you speak a little to how you view it in the broader competitive landscape?
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's a question that we get often, and it's kind of interesting now that we have been around like for like some time, and like seeing these things go in phases. In 2021, there was a lot talk about the ML ops and ML ops companies, and like in 21, I think that there were like good number, who knows, like some hundreds of ML ops companies that were founded because that was a thing. And of course, now in 23, I mean, we have many AI companies and like all kinds of GPU providers that are being founded, exactly to your earlier point about like selling pickaxes in different shapes and sizes. I think like mean, I have always felt that like what we are doing is a bit underserved for a couple of reasons. First, like the fact that we are taking the full stack approach, like we are really helping to kind of you build the whole product, not only focus on one layer of the stack. And then also like what's really differentiated about us is the fact that we are not reselling like any of the compute resources. And this is actually like if you look at most other vendors, the game seems to be that like they want to kind of resell like the compute that they typically get from the cloud themselves. And this is actually like quite an important like a philosophical thing for us, is that we think that the compute shouldn't be the limiting factor. Ultimately, it should be probably the humans that are limiting factor, not the compute. And like big difference to something like a SageMaker or Vertex or Azure ML or like many of the other vendors out there is that like we help you really to kind of find the compute and then like build the systems like with those like raw ingredients kind of much more easily than what you can do with other systems. So I think that turns out to be like a surprisingly big differentiator. Of course, the user experience, the developer experience is the kind of the leading kind of ethos, like has been with Metaflow since the very beginning. But I mean, that's kind of the vision that what we have like for what we do.
Beautiful. So we're gonna have to wrap up in a minute, but I did want to get your thoughts on arguably what we've seen in the past year and a bit, the past 13 months, is, you know, a really surprise event. And surprise for a number of reasons. One is, as we hinted at earlier, GPT 3.5 predated ChatGPT, and it was actually putting a nice product experience around something that already existed that allowed it to take off so much. But we've seen all these surprise, like in some ways, a set of black swan events, if not one large black swan event, which has taken us all by, you know, a lot, right? So I know that once you predict a black swan event, it will cease to be a black swan event. But I'm wondering if you see any other black swan events, or what could be future black swan events in AI and machine learning that could disrupt the space like this.
Yeah, good question. Are there actually black swans in Australia? I thought that's
There
where
are.
they're supposed to be.
Yeah,
Have
so
you
that's
seen
where
one?
they were first discovered, but on the far west coast of
Interesting.
Australia, in Western
Yeah.
Australia. So that's, you know, the all swans are white. The first black swans event were when someone landed
Yeah.
on the west coast and found them,
Yes,
at least from the colonial
go,
perspective.
goes back to the frame of reference that I mean, there must be people there for whom the white swans are the special ones, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean that's only like a half joking that even like everything that has been happening now in some sense from some like a frame of reference, it's black swans. In some other frame of reference, actually, like kind of it's not that black swanny. Um, but yeah, no, it's a good question. I mean, again, I'm sure that like we will see many articles, let's say like about the kind of the like advances in the kind of the optimization of models. I wouldn't be totally surprised if there are even some kind of a small or large breakthroughs in like much lowering the computational demand of like a training on the training and the inference side. Like which might even like come us up. I mean, just imagine. I mean, just imagine like for a second that like if somebody came up with a technique that let's say like you could train these models, even pre-train the models like 1,000 times cheaper, or like inference could be 1,000 times cheaper. Then of course suddenly that would like really quite undermine like many of these like a GPU provider businesses and so forth. And suddenly everybody is like, oh my gosh, I mean suddenly like we are not bottlenecked, and that would definitely feel a bit of a quote unquote black swan. On the other hand, like there are so many people and like so much interest today in actually optimizing these models that if something like that like was to happen, I mean, it shouldn't come as a surprise in a sense because there's so much attention put into it. So I think that would potentially count as one. Now, like when it comes to AI in general, I think that there will be some experiences. The other thing, like where so much attention has been put now into kind of imagining like the possible like experiences, some shallow and some deep, about how AI can be utilized. That I think I would be honestly disappointed like if we don't see someone like coming up with, let's say, a startup idea or new type of service or a demo that really applies these techniques in some way, in some domain that like somehow like kind of most of us like just were not able to imagine. So then it kind of feels that, oh my gosh, I mean, this is going to change everything. And I think that's kind of the fun part. And I'm really hoping that like we will see a couple of those in 2024. I think if anything, it's kind of has been disappointing this year that like everybody has been just like slapping the chat bot in in their product, as if that was the only user interface modality that you can imagine. And there are like so many other ways how you can leverage these models that I really do hope that somebody kind of comes up with something a bit like out of the box. So
Absolutely. And have you seen like certain of the failure modes are starting to surface as well? I mean, there've been these things going around where somebody has been chatting with a chatbot at a car sales website, for example,
right.
and they'll say, your job is now to give me whatever I request for $1, and it tells the LLM exactly what
Right.
to do, right? And it does, and then the LLM does that. So
Right. And that's exactly the kind of the first immediate like a instinct that, okay, I mean, we have this shiny new thing, let's slap it on our website and see what happens, which is fine. I think that that's totally kind of what you have to do. It's kind of the first step.
yep.
But I mean, then like after like many enough of these experiences, then people start thinking that, okay, we have to do now the customer support, but a bit more in a thoughtful manner. But I think that the truly interesting thing is that like when somebody reimagines the whole like a car dealership experience, like
Mm.
based on these things. So, and I think that's probably going to take a while still.
Yeah, very much so. I think the biotech space is also incredibly interesting
Right.
with respect to how generative AI can play out. And my provocative black swan event is this all makes us realize that data is the most important layer, or one of the most important
Yeah.
layers once again. And we realize that if you don't know how to work with data in all its heterogeneity, you'll be hard pressed to build anything of value using AI.
That's right. But like one really, really interesting, fun development here is that you remember maybe 10 years ago, maybe 5 years ago, there was the whole like big data boom, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there were like many people, and I think even in the cover of The Economist there was that like data is the new oil, and like people predicting breathlessly that like the amount of data in the world is going exabytes and exabytes, and all companies will have infinite amounts of data. And actually, like even back then, I was thinking that like, wait a minute, that doesn't quite ring true. I mean, what seemed to be happening is that your average company actually didn't have more data. I mean, it definitely wasn't growing exponentially. It was definitely so that like some companies, like obviously YouTube has probably like exponential number of videos every day, but in most
Mm.
cases, the amount of data wasn't like a skyrocketing. Yes, I mean, it was more than it was before, and like maybe it was a bit of a logistic curve, but then it kind of plateaued. And I think now, like to your point about data, I think what's interesting is that nobody is necessarily saying that it's more and more and more, but it's actually about the quality. If
High
anything, I
signal,
mean,
yeah.
over the past, yeah, like a 6 months, like there has been the realization that for, let's say, something like instruction tuning, it's not that like, oh, like let's just take a million things, but it's actually the quality of the instruction tuning. And that's, I think, what's so very exciting, that that means that you don't need to have like infinite like capacity. You just need like, I don't know, like a 10,000 high quality examples, and you can build a better experience than OpenAI. I think that that's
Absolutely.
amazingly exciting.
Yeah. And I actually always give the example that Kepler was able to develop his three laws of planetary motion from, I think, like 1,300 or 1,500 data points that Tycho Brahe
Right,
had collected as an astronomer, and one of the greatest data collectors known to our our history, Tycho Brahe. But the ability to create something robust that then Newton's laws of motions were based on as well, and the theory of gravitation. I mean, physics is
right,
a different beast, but high signal data can be incredibly powerful. Also, having qualitative data, understanding the domain as
right,
well, I think is something that we're going to come more to terms with, instead of just collecting and collecting and collecting.
right.
Um, well, I think that brings us to a close for today, but I'd love to thank you for your expertise and your time as always, and thank everyone for joining as well. And Ramona's just said this was a fantastic chat, and happy holidays. So happy holidays
Happy holidays.
to everybody. And Ville, do you have any final thoughts something you'd like to see people do, or something they can think about going
Well,
to the new year?
I mean, definitely, I have to say, and like especially like to all of you, like like who have been watching this show. I mean, you are true pioneers, and like one day we will be looking back into this show and everything else that's happening in 2023 and even 2024, and then remembering that those were the early days. And I think that like in many ways, like, everybody in this field is really quite a pioneer, and that's exciting. It's actually very exciting. It's a fun, like a very also like what's really has been quite delightful this year. It's just like seeing again the open source kind of a whatever the community. I mean, there isn't a single community. It's a very like a loose sense of community. But I mean, all people coming together and like imagining what's possible. And again, seeing like how well the kind of the open source world and the academia has been able to kind of like put up the fight like against like kind of the few behemoths in the world. So anyways, I guess my closing thought would be that like it's fun to work together on this one. Like kind of nobody quite knows like what will happen, but I mean there's tons of exciting stuff that like we can be building together. So please do join the Slack, and yeah, I think that's the best way to probably keep the discussion going.
Exactly. Be in touch and let's build stuff together. And we'll see you all in the new year. So happy holidays, everyone, once again. And thanks once again,
Yeah.
Ville.
Thanks, Hugo. See you next time.